morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as David Brennan adjusted his hard hat and surveyed the skeletal framework of what would become Seattle's newest luxury hotel. At 42, he had built an empire from nothing, starting as a day laborer and climbing to become the city's most respected construction magnate. His calloused hands told the story of every nail he'd driven, every beam he'd lifted in those early years. "Mr. Brennan, the investors are here for the walkthrough," called his foreman, Rico Valdez, a loyal man who'd been with David since the beginning. David nodded, checking his watch. Time was money in construction, and David respected both with religious devotion. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife, Lily, "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. Hugs and kisses." The third time this week. David frowned but pushed the thought aside. Lily had been distant lately, but he attributed it to stress from her marketing firm. After 12 years of marriage, he trusted her completely, perhaps too completely. The investors' meeting went smoothly. David's reputation for delivering projects on time and under budget preceded him. As he shook hands with the development group's leader, Margaret Chun, she mentioned something that would later haunt him. "My daughter works at Pinnacle Marketing," she said casually. "Same firm as your wife, I believe." "Small world." "Indeed it is," David replied, though something in her tone seemed odd. That evening, David arrived home to their sprawling house in Bellevue, a testament to his success with its custom stonework and imported Italian marble. The house was dark except for a light in Lily's home office. He found her there, frantically closing laptop screens. "Hey, beautiful," he said, kissing the top of her auburn hair. "Working late." Lily's green eyes were bright with what he now realized was guilt, not exhaustion. "Just finishing up a campaign proposal. You know how it is." David had built his empire on reading people, on sensing when something wasn't right with a foundation before it cracked. But love, he would learn, makes even the sharpest minds blind. Later that night, as Lily slept beside him, David stared at the ceiling thinking about Margaret Chen's daughter. Something nagged at him, the way Margaret had paused before mentioning Pinnacle Marketing, as if choosing her words carefully. But David pushed the feeling down. Paranoia was a luxury he couldn't afford. What he didn't know was that 3 blocks away, Lily's lover was also staring at the ceiling, planning his next move. Chapter 2. The Other Foundation. Troy Kellerman had always been a man who took what he wanted. At 38, with his perfectly styled blonde hair and designer suits, he'd charm his way through life like a wolf in expensive clothing. As creative director at Pinnacle Marketing, he was Lily's supervisor and her downfall. Troy came from old Seattle money, the kind that owned waterfront properties when the city was still growing. His father, Raymond Kellerman, had made the family fortune in timber before diversifying into real estate. But Troy had always been the black sheep, preferring easy conquests to hard work. "You're playing with fire," his friend and fellow executive, Brett Morrison, warned him over lunch at their exclusive club. "David Brennan isn't someone you want as an enemy." Troy swirled his scotch, amused. "The construction worker? Please. He's too busy with his little building blocks to notice what's happening under his own roof." Brett shifted uncomfortably. He'd heard stories about David Brennan, not just his business success, but his reputation from the old days. Before David became respectable, he'd earned respect through different means in the rough construction world. "I'm serious, Troy. I've heard things about Brennan. Before he went legitimate, he had a way of dealing with people who crossed him. There are stories." "Stories," Troy scoffed. "Rich people love stories about the dangerous poor making good. It makes us feel exotic for associating with them." What Troy didn't understand was that David had never stopped being dangerous. He'd simply learned to channel that danger through legal means, most of the time. Meanwhile, Lily was falling deeper into Troy's web. Their affair had started 6 months ago during a weekend corporate retreat. Troy had a talent for making married women feel special, neglected, deserving of more. He whispered the right words about David being too focused on work, too rough around the edges for someone as refined as Lily. The truth was, Lily had always felt slightly out of place in David's world. Her background was different: private schools, country clubs, a father who practiced corporate law. When she'd met David 8 years ago, his raw ambition and intensity had been intoxicating. But as the years passed and David's empire grew, she felt increasingly like an accessory to his success rather than a partner in it. Troy offered her something different: sophistication, culture, late-night conversations about art and literature. He made her feel intelligent in ways that David, with his practical focus, never did. It was a seduction as much intellectual as physical. "He doesn't appreciate you," Troy would whisper during their hotel encounters. "A woman like you needs someone who understands your value." Lily knew she was making a mistake, but Troy's attention was like a drug. She told herself it was just temporary, just until she figured out what she really wanted. But Troy was already planning something more permanent. He'd been researching David's business, looking for weaknesses. What Troy discovered intrigued him. David's empire, while successful, was built on a complex web of partnerships and leveraged properties. The right pressure applied in the right places could bring it all tumbling down. And when it did, Troy would be there to offer Lily a different kind of life. What neither Troy nor Lily realized was that David's network of connections ran deeper than either imagined. In construction, information travels fast, and loyalty, real loyalty, is earned through shared struggle. David had earned that loyalty many times over. Chapter 3. The Crack Spreads. The grocery store incident happened on a Thursday afternoon. David had returned early from a site inspection in Tacoma, stopping to buy flowers for Lily, white roses, her favorites, to surprise her for their upcoming anniversary. He'd been chatting with Mrs. Patterson, the elderly cashier who'd known them both for years, when the word slipped out. "Oh, you're back. Your husband was here yesterday buying flowers for." David's blood turned to ice. "What did you say?" Mrs. Patterson's face went pale as she realized her mistake. I'm sorry, I thought. The gentleman yesterday. He said he was buying them for Lily." David's mind raced. Yesterday he'd been in Portland, overseeing the final inspection of a medical center. He had receipts, witnesses, hotel records. What did this man look like? Tall, blonde hair, very well dressed. Expensive suit. He seemed to know you both very well. David paid for his flowers with hands that didn't shake. He'd trained himself never to show weakness, even when his world was crumbling. But inside, the foundations of his life were shifting like a building in an earthquake. He drove home in silence, his mind working through possibilities. Part of him hoped for an innocent explanation, but his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive in his younger, harder days, were screaming warnings. When he found Lily in her office, frantically closing laptops, the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Her guilt was written across her face like graffiti on a pristine wall. "Working late?" he asked, testing her. "Just finishing up a campaign proposal," she lied smoothly. David had built his career on foundations and trust. When either failed, the entire structure collapsed. That night, lying beside his sleeping wife, he began planning his response. The next morning, while Lily showered, David did something he'd never done before. He went through her phone. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Months of deleted messages, careful gaps in her calendar, and most damning of all, a saved photo of Troy Kellerman from the Pinnacle marketing website. David studied the face of the man who'd stolen his wife. Handsome in a soft way, the kind of man who'd never worked with his hands or earned anything through sweat. The kind of man who took things that belonged to others because he could. But David had spent 25 years building his empire in a world where the strong survived and the weak made excuses. He'd faced down union bosses, corrupt officials, and competitors who thought his working-class background made him easy prey. They'd all learned the same lesson. David Brennan might have cleaned up his act, but he'd never lost his edge. As Lily kissed him goodbye that morning, promising to be home early, David was already 3 moves ahead. He made 2 phone calls before leaving for work. The first was to Margaret Chen's daughter, Amy, whom he'd met at several corporate functions. A few careful questions revealed that Troy Kellerman had a reputation at Pinnacle Marketing, and that Lily wasn't his first married conquest. The second call was to Rico Valdez. "Rico, I need you to put together a team. Quiet guys, the kind who don't ask questions. I'll explain when I see you." Rico had worked for David long enough to recognize that tone. "How quiet we talking, boss?" The kind that keeps their mouth shut and does exactly what they're told. "Can you do that?" "For you? Always." David hung up and allowed himself a smile that would have chilled anyone who saw it. Troy Kellerman and Lily thought they were playing a sophisticated game of deception. But David had been playing a much older, much more dangerous game since before either of them knew what real stakes looked like. The war was about to begin, and David intended to win it so completely that his enemies would serve as a warning to anyone else who might think of crossing him. Chapter 4. Reconnaissance. David's transformation over the next 2 weeks was subtle but complete. To the outside world, he remained the same successful businessman, arriving at job sites at dawn and working until dusk. But underneath, he was conducting a different kind of construction project, building a foundation for revenge. His first step was intelligence gathering. David had learned long ago that information was more valuable than gold, and he'd spent years cultivating sources throughout Seattle's business community. A quiet word to his accountant, Mitchell Owens, revealed Troy Kellerman's financial situation. Despite his family money, Troy was heavily leveraged. Expensive tastes and poor investments had left him living beyond his means. Interesting timing for his lifestyle expenses to spike, Mitchell noted, reviewing the discreet financial background check David had requested. New luxury car lease, upscale restaurant charges, hotel rooms at the Four Seasons. Either he got a raise or he's trying to impress someone. David's jaw tightened. The hotel charges lined up perfectly with Lily's late nights at work. His second source was even more valuable. Carmen Rodriguez, who managed security for half the office buildings in downtown Seattle. Her company had the contract for Pinnacle Marketing's building. "I can't give you footage," Carmen said as they sat in her office. "But I can tell you that your wife's been meeting with Troy Kellerman in his office after hours. 3, sometimes 4 times a week. Always when the building's mostly empty." David slid an envelope across her desk. Carmen had helped him with security issues on various construction sites over the years, and her loyalty was unquestioned. "I appreciate your discretion, David," Carmen said seriously. "Whatever you're planning, be careful. Kellerman's father has connections throughout the city. Old money means old friends in high places." "I'm always careful," David replied, but his smile suggested otherwise. The third phase of his reconnaissance was more personal. David began following Lily and Troy, learning their patterns, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He discovered that Troy had a weakness for high-stakes poker games in a back room at an upscale restaurant called Meridian. More importantly, he learned that Troy was already in debt to some very serious people. Danny Torino ran the game, and while his restaurant was legitimate, his side businesses were decidedly less so. David and Danny had crossed paths years ago when David was first starting out, back when he'd needed different kinds of favors to keep his business afloat. David Brennan. Danny smiled when David walked into Meridian one evening. "Heard you'd gone completely respectable." "Mostly," David said, taking a seat at Danny's private table. "I need a favor." "For old time's sake?" "For the usual terms." Danny's smile widened. In their world, favors were currency, and David had always been good for payment. "What do you need?" "Troy Kellerman's been playing in your game. I want to know exactly how much he owes and to whom." "That's confidential information, David." David placed a briefcase on the table. "Consider this a consulting fee." Danny opened it, examined the contents, and nodded. "Kellerman's into us for $60,000. He's been covering it with minimum payments, but he's walking a thin line." "What?" "Because I'm about to make his life very expensive," David said. "And when I do, he's going to need cash fast. Can you make sure he gets deeper in the hole instead of out of it? For the right consideration, I can make sure he has access to credit he can't afford. High-interest stuff. The kind that compounds quickly." "Perfect. And Danny? When the time comes, I'll buy his debt from you." Danny leaned back, impressed. "You really have gone sophisticated. In the old days, you'd have just broken his legs." "I'm older now," David said. "I prefer breaking spirits." As David left Meridian, he felt the familiar rush of a plan coming together. But this was only the beginning. Destroying Troy financially would be satisfying, but it wouldn't be enough. David wanted complete victory, the kind that would leave both Troy and Lily with nothing but regret. He had one more stop to make that night. Amy Chun, Margaret's daughter, had agreed to meet him for coffee. She'd been watching the situation at Pinnacle Marketing with professional interest and personal disgust. "Troy's a predator," she said bluntly. "Your wife isn't his first conquest, and she won't be his last unless someone stops him. Tell me about the others." Amy's expression darkened. "Jennifer Walsh, account executive. Married, 2 kids. Troy seduced her, convinced her to leave her husband, then dumped her when he got bored. She had a nervous breakdown and lost custody of her children." David's hands clenched around his coffee cup. "Anyone else?" "Susan Grant, from the Portland office." Similar story. Troy has a pattern. He targets married women who feel underappreciated, makes them feel special, then moves on when the novelty wears off. He leaves destruction in his wake and never faces consequences. He will this time, David said quietly. Amy studied his face. What are you planning? Justice, David replied. The kind that lasts. Chapter 5, Setting the Trap. The genius of David's plan lay in its simplicity. Rather than attack Troy directly, he would create a series of seemingly unconnected pressures that would drive his enemy into increasingly desperate choices. It was like controlled demolition. Apply pressure to the right structural points, and the entire building would collapse exactly where you wanted it to. Phase 1 began with Troy's poker debt. Danny Torino, acting on David's instructions, began extending Troy additional credit while simultaneously increasing the pressure for repayment. Within 2 weeks, Troy's debt had ballooned to over $100,000. I don't understand. Troy complained to Brett Morrison over lunch. They keep offering me more credit, but the terms are getting worse. Brett, who'd been quietly investigating David Brennan on his own, felt a chill of recognition. Troy, you need to stop playing immediately. Something's not right. But Troy was already in too deep. The debt was crushing him, and his only hope was to win enough in one big game to break even. It was the classic gambler's fallacy, and David was counting on it. Phase 2 targeted Troy's professional life. David had discovered that Pinnacle Marketing was competing for a massive municipal contract, the kind that could define a company's future. Through his connections in city government, David learned the exact specifications the city was looking for and began subtly influencing the requirements to favor his own hastily created marketing subsidiary. David's new company, Northwest Communications, was officially run by his cousin Tony Brennan, a former military officer with legitimate marketing experience. But David was pulling the strings from behind the scenes, using his construction industry contacts to craft a proposal that would be impossible for Pinnacle to match. The city wants a firm with experience in infrastructure marketing, David explained to Tony. They want someone who understands the construction industry from the ground up, which Pinnacle doesn't, Tony observed. Exactly. And when they lose this contract, there's going to be some serious house cleaning at that company, starting with their overpaid creative director. Phase 3 was more personal. David had been documenting Lily and Troy's affair meticulously, photos of them entering hotels, restaurant receipts charged to Troy's credit cards, even audio recordings from a device he'd planted in Lily's car. But rather than confront them directly, he began leaving subtle hints that he was becoming suspicious. He started asking Lily more questions about her work, showing unexpected interest in her projects and colleagues. He mentioned running into Margaret Shun, casually bringing up her daughter Amy, who worked at Pinnacle. He began arriving home at unexpected times, always with innocent explanations. The psychological pressure was enormous. Lily became increasingly paranoid, convinced that David was on the verge of discovering her affair. She began pressuring Troy to leave his wife and make their relationship public. He knows something, she whispered during one of their hotel meetings. The way he looks at me, the questions he asks. David's not stupid. Troy, we need to decide what we're doing. Troy, already stressed about his mounting debts and the increasing pressure at work, made the mistake David had been hoping for. He began making careless decisions. Desperate to keep Lily calm and convinced that he was serious about their future, Troy started making promises he couldn't keep. After the municipal contract comes through, I'll be in line for a promotion to partner, he lied. We can go public then. Maybe even move to San Francisco, start fresh. But Troy didn't know that the municipal contract was already lost. David's bid was so perfectly tailored to the city's needs that Pinnacle's proposal looked amateurish by comparison. When the results were announced, Troy's position at the company would become precarious. The fourth phase was the most brutal. David began systematically destroying Troy's other relationships. Using his network of construction industry contacts, David spread carefully crafted rumors about Troy's gambling debts and unstable personal life. Seattle's business community was smaller than people realized, and reputation was everything. Within a month, Troy found himself subtly excluded from important social events. Business associates became distant. Even his own family began asking uncomfortable questions about his lifestyle and financial situation. Raymond Kellerman called me today, Margaret Chin mentioned to David during a chance encounter at a city planning meeting. Seems his son is having some difficulties. I'm sorry to hear that, David replied with perfect sincerity. Margaret studied his face carefully. She'd lived in Seattle long enough to recognize when wheels were turning behind the scenes. David, I hope you know what you're doing. I always know what I'm doing, David said. That's why I'm successful. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. David had been saving his greatest weapon for last, the truth about Troy's pattern of destroying marriages. Amy Chun had connected him with Jennifer Walsh and Susan Grant, both of whom were willing to share their stories. More importantly, David had discovered that Troy was already pursuing his next target, Rebecca Torres, a junior account manager at Pinnacle who'd recently married her college sweetheart. Troy's predatory behavior was escalating, and David had everything documented. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it at exactly the right moment for maximum devastation. David had learned patience in construction. You couldn't rush a foundation, and you couldn't rush justice. But when the time came, both would be solid enough to build upon for the rest of his life. Chapter 6. The Pressure Builds. By the end of the third week, Troy Kellerman was beginning to understand that his life was unraveling, but he still couldn't see the architect behind his destruction. The gambling debts had reached critical mass. Danny Torino's men were making increasingly less subtle inquiries about payment schedules. The municipal contract loss had triggered a company-wide review at Pinnacle Marketing, with Troy's department facing potential restructuring. We're bleeding clients, Pinnacle CEO Victoria Marsh announced during an emergency executive meeting. The municipal contract was supposed to be our anchor for the next 5 years. Without it, we're looking at serious budget cuts. Troy felt the walls closing in. His salary, and more importantly, his expense account, were about to be slashed just when he needed money most desperately. He'd already maxed out his credit cards covering minimum payments to Danny's operation. Meanwhile, Lily was becoming increasingly unstable. David's psychological warfare was working perfectly. Every innocent comment from her husband felt like an accusation, every casual question like an interrogation. He asked about my laptop last night, she told Troy during one of their increasingly tense meetings. Wanted to know why I was working so much at home. Troy, I can't take this much longer. Troy tried to project confidence he didn't feel. Just give me a few more weeks. I'm working on something that will solve all our problems. What Troy was working on was a desperate scheme to steal clients from Pinnacle before the layoffs hit. He'd been secretly meeting with several major accounts, trying to convince them to follow him to a new boutique agency he planned to start. It was a violation of his non-compete clause and grounds for immediate termination, but desperation was making him reckless. David, monitoring Troy's communications through Amy Chin's access to company systems, was delighted by this development. Troy was about to hand him the perfect weapon for complete professional destruction. But David wasn't content with just financial and professional ruin. He wanted psychological devastation. So he arranged for Lily to discover something that would shatter her illusions about Troy completely. David had Rico's team plant evidence of Troy's other affairs in places where Lily would find them. A receipt for jewelry that she'd never received, charged to Troy's credit card 3 months earlier. A reservation confirmation for a romantic weekend at a Napa Valley resort, for the same weekend Troy had told Lily he was visiting his sick mother. The devastating revelation came when Amy Chun accidentally forwarded Lily an email chain discussing Troy's pursuit of Rebecca Torres. The messages, carefully edited to include the most damaging quotes, painted Troy as a serial predator who saw married women as conquests to be collected and discarded. Did you know there's a betting pool in the office about how long it takes him to get bored with you? Amy had written, as if sharing gossip between friends. Jennifer Walsh lasted 8 months. Susan Grant made it to 10. Rebecca's marriage is only 6 months old, so she's the new challenge. Lily read the emails in her car outside Pinnacle's office building, her hands shaking with rage and humiliation. Everything she'd risked, everything she'd sacrificed, had been for a man who saw her as nothing more than another conquest in a game she didn't even know she was playing. That night, she confronted Troy in his office after hours. "What is this?" she demanded, throwing printed copies of the emails across his desk. Troy's face went white as he recognized the contents. "Lily, you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice deadly calm. "I'm just another notch on your belt. Another bored housewife too stupid to see what she was getting into. That's not true, Troy protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The stress of his mounting problems had made him careless with his other relationships, and he couldn't deny the evidence. It's over, Lily said. All of it. I'm going to tell David everything. Troy's desperation peaked. You can't. You'll destroy both of us. David will take everything in the divorce, your house, your security, everything you've built together. I've built nothing, Lily replied bitterly. I've been living someone else's life, playing someone else's game. At least David's honest about who he is. After Lily left, Troy sat alone in his office, finally understanding the magnitude of his situation. He was about to lose his job, his financial security, and possibly his physical safety if he couldn't pay his gambling debts. The one thing that had made it all seem worthwhile, his relationship with Lily, was gone. In his desperation, Troy made the worst decision of his life. He decided to go to David directly, man to man, and try to negotiate some kind of deal. He would confess to the affair, accept responsibility, and ask for mercy. Perhaps David, as a fellow businessman, would understand that these things happened and could be resolved rationally. It was exactly what David had been waiting for. The call came on a Friday evening. David was in his home office, reviewing blueprints for a new project, when his phone rang. Mr. Brennan? This is Troy Kellerman. I think we need to talk. David's smile could have cut glass. I think you're right. My office, tomorrow morning at 9. Come alone. As he hung up, David felt the satisfaction of a master craftsman viewing a completed project. The demolition phase was over. Tomorrow, he would begin construction of his final revenge. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. David's office occupied the top floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. The space reflected its owner, substantial, uncompromising, built to last. Native stone walls displayed awards and photos documenting David's rise from laborer to industry titan. Behind his desk hung a framed hard hat, the same one he'd worn on his first job site 25 years earlier. Troy arrived precisely at 9, his usual confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man with no good options. He dressed carefully in his most expensive suit, as if armor could protect him from what was coming. David didn't stand when Troy entered. He simply gestured to the chair across from his massive oak desk, a piece crafted from timber salvage from one of his earliest renovation projects. Sit, David said quietly. Troy sat, trying to project calm he didn't feel. Up close, David Brennan was even more intimidating than his reputation suggested. There was something coiled and dangerous in his stillness, like a predator deciding whether its prey was worth the effort to hunt. I suppose you know why I'm here, Troy began. Enlighten me. Troy swallowed hard. There's been a situation between your wife and myself. I wanted to address it directly, man to man. David leaned back in his chair, studying Troy with the same intensity he might examine a structural flaw. A situation. That's an interesting way to describe 6 months of adultery. The precision of David's knowledge hit Troy like a physical blow. You. How long have you known? Longer than you might think. The question is, what did you hope to accomplish by coming here? Troy had rehearsed this conversation, but David's calm was unnerving. He'd expected anger, violence, or at least raised voices. This cold composure was somehow worse. I wanted to apologize, Troy said, and to discuss how we might resolve this situation with minimal damage to everyone involved. David's laugh was like breaking glass. Minimal damage. Tell me, Troy, what damage do you think you've caused? I know I've hurt you. And Lily, I take full responsibility for that. Do you? David stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the construction site where this had all begun. Let me tell you about damage, Troy. Real damage. David turned back to face his enemy. Damage is learning that your wife has been lying to you for months. Damage is discovering that a man you'd never wronged decided to destroy your marriage for sport. Damage is realizing that everyone around you knew what was happening except you. Troy shifted uncomfortably. I never meant for it to go this far. No, I don't suppose you did. Men like you never think about consequences. You take what you want and assume someone else will clean up the mess. David returned to his desk, opening a thick folder. But here's what I find interesting, Troy. This isn't the first time you've caused this kind of damage, is it? Troy's face went pale as David began reading from the folder. Jennifer Walsh. Divorced her husband, lost custody of her children, had a nervous breakdown. Currently in therapy and working as a waitress to pay her legal bills. David looked up. That was your handiwork, wasn't it? That was different. Susan Grant destroyed her marriage, convinced her to quit her job and move to Seattle to be with you, then abandoned her when you got bored. She attempted suicide last year. David's voice never rose, never showed emotion. Different how? Troy said nothing. And now Rebecca Torres, 24 years old, married 8 months, and you're already circling her like a vulture. David closed the folder with deliberate care. So tell me again about minimal damage. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Troy found his voice. What do you want? David smiled, and Troy understood why smart people feared this man. I want justice, Troy. The kind that lasts. David opened another folder, this one thicker than the first. Let's discuss your current situation. Gambling debts totaling $137,000 to Danny Torino's organization. Your position at Pinnacle Marketing about to be eliminated due to the municipal contract they lost to my company, incidentally. Credit cards maxed out, personal loans in default, and your father's trust fund frozen pending investigation of your attempts to steal clients from Pinnacle. Troy's composure finally cracked. How do you know all this? Because I orchestrated it. David's voice remained conversational, as if discussing the weather. Every debt, every professional failure, every door that's closed in your face over the past month, that was me. The truth hit Troy like a sledgehammer. You set me up. I created opportunities for you to reveal your true character. You made every destructive choice yourself. David leaned forward. But we're not finished yet. David activated his computer monitor, showing Troy a video feed. On the screen, Troy could see Danny Torino's men waiting in the building's lobby. They're here to collect on your debt, David explained. Danny sold your markers to me this morning. $137,000, plus interest and collection fees. The total comes to exactly $200,000. Troy's hands began shaking. I don't have that kind of money. I know. Which brings us to our negotiation. David stood again, walking around the desk to loom over Troy's chair. I'm prepared to forgive your debt completely, in exchange for a small service. What service? David returned to his desk and pressed a button on his intercom. Send her up. 2 minutes later, the office door opened and Lily walked in. Her face was tear-streaked but determined. She looked at Troy with a mixture of disgust and pity, then took her place beside David's desk. Your wife has something she wants to say, David told Troy. Lily's voice was steady despite her tears. I've told David everything. About us, about your lies, about the other women. Everything. Troy looked between them, confusion replacing fear. I don't understand. David's smile was sharp as a blade. My wife came to me 3 days ago and confessed her affair. She told me about your pattern of destroying marriages, about your debts, about your plan to steal Pinnacle's clients. She's agreed to testify to all of this in exchange for my forgiveness. The betrayal hit Troy harder than any physical blow could have. Lily, how could you? How could I what? Tell the truth? Refuse to let you destroy another family. Lily's voice was gaining strength. I was your victim too, Troy, but I won't be your accomplice. David watched Troy's face cycle through emotions, rage, betrayal, despair. This was the moment he'd been building toward, the complete psychological destruction of his enemy. Here's your choice, Troy, David said quietly. You can walk out of here and face Danny's men in the lobby, or you can sign these papers. David placed a thick legal document on the desk. It's a complete confession of your affairs, your pattern of predatory behavior, and your attempts to steal Pinnacle's clients. You'll also agree to leave Seattle permanently and never contact any of your victims again. Troy stared at the papers. And if I sign, your debt disappears. You'll receive a reference letter that will help you find work in another city, and you'll live to start over somewhere else. This is blackmail. This is justice. The kind that gives your victims closure and prevents you from creating new ones. Troy looked at Lily one last time, seeing only contempt in her eyes. The woman who'd once hung on his every word now looked at him like something that had crawled out from under a rock. With trembling hands, Troy signed the papers. Excellent, David said, collecting the documents. My security team will escort you to the airport. Your flight to Phoenix leaves in 3 hours. Don't miss it. As Troy was led away, he turned back one last time. This isn't over, Brennan. David's smile was colder than winter in Seattle. Yes, it is. Chapter 8. Reconstruction. The months following Troy's exile passed like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each movement building toward David's ultimate vision of justice. Lily had returned to their marriage, but it was a return to a structure rebuilt entirely on David's terms. "I'm grateful you forgave me," Lily said one morning as they shared coffee in their renovated kitchen. David had gut-renovated the space immediately after Troy's departure, stripping away every surface that might hold memories of her betrayal. "I didn't forgive you," David replied calmly, reading his morning construction reports. "I accepted your surrender." The distinction wasn't lost on Lily. Her life now operated within parameters David had established with the same precision he brought to his construction projects. She'd kept her job at Pinnacle Marketing, under new management after Victoria Marsh's resignation, but her communications were monitored, her schedule was accounted for, and her social interactions were limited to people David approved. It wasn't imprisonment, exactly. It was something more subtle and permanent, the complete reconstruction of their power dynamic. Lily had agency within carefully defined boundaries, like a subcontractor working under David's supervision. "Rebecca Torres called yesterday," Lily mentioned carefully. "She wanted to thank us again for the warning about Troy." David looked up from his papers. When Troy's confession had been quietly circulated through Pinnacle's management, it had revealed his predatory pattern to everyone who needed to know. Rebecca had been grateful to learn the truth before she'd made any irreversible mistakes. "How is her marriage?" David asked. "Stronger than ever," she says. "Sometimes surviving a threat together makes people appreciate what they have." David nodded approvingly. Rebecca Torres had been the one potential victim he'd saved rather than avenged, and her happiness validated his broader strategy. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about protection. The professional aftermath had been even more satisfying. Pinnacle Marketing had undergone a complete restructuring, with Amy Chen promoted to creative director. The company's new leadership had implemented strict policies about workplace relationships and professional conduct. Troy's former victims had been quietly compensated through a discretionary fund David had established. Jennifer Walsh was back in school, earning her MBA. Susan Grant had relocated to Portland and was rebuilding her career with a fresh start. Both women had received anonymous funding for therapy and career development, David's way of ensuring that Troy's damage was truly repaired rather than simply acknowledged. But the crown jewel of David's reconstruction project was Troy himself. David had kept careful tabs on his former enemy, tracking his movements through a network of contacts that stretched across multiple states. Troy had landed in Phoenix, as planned, but his promised fresh start had proven more challenging than expected. The reference letter David had provided was technically accurate, but subtly damaging. It praised Troy's creativity while questioning his judgment, commended his social skills while noting concerns about his professionalism. It was the kind of letter that would get him interviews, but not job offers. More importantly, David had ensured that Troy's reputation preceded him wherever he went. Seattle's business community was well connected to other major cities, and word of Troy's difficulties had traveled through professional networks like cracks through poorly mixed concrete. "Sir," Rico Valdez appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but you asked me to update you on the Phoenix situation." David nodded to Lily, who understood this was her cue to leave. She kissed his cheek and departed for work, another routine in their carefully structured new life. "What's the status?" David asked once they were alone. "Kellerman's been turned down for his fourth position in 3 months, Rico reported. His savings are almost gone, and he's living in a studio apartment in a rough part of town. Word is, he's been asking around about gambling opportunities." David smiled grimly. Some men never learned. And his family? His father cut him off completely after the Pinnacle scandal broke. Mother won't take his calls. His brother changed his phone number. The thoroughness of Troy's isolation was almost artistic. David had spent months ensuring that every door was closed, every bridge was burned, every avenue of escape was sealed. Troy Kellerman was discovering what it felt like to be truly alone in the world. Any sign he's trying to contact his former victims? Nothing. The restraining orders we helped them obtain seem to be working. Plus, his confession makes any contact a violation of his plea agreement. David nodded satisfaction. The legal framework he'd constructed around Troy's punishment was as solid as any foundation he'd ever poured. There would be no appeals, no second chances, no redemption arc. Troy would carry the consequences of his choices for the rest of his life. Keep monitoring the situation. If he tries to hurt anyone else, I want to know immediately. Understood, boss. After Rico left, David stood at his kitchen window, looking out at the city he'd helped build. Seattle's skyline was dotted with his projects: hotels, office buildings, residential towers that housed thousands of families. Each structure was built to last, designed to withstand whatever pressures time and nature could apply. His marriage was being rebuilt the same way. Lily had proven she could be trusted within defined parameters, and David was content to maintain those parameters indefinitely. Love, he'd learned, was less important than loyalty. Passion was less valuable than predictability. Some men might have seen this as a hollow victory, maintaining a marriage built on surveillance and control rather than trust. But David had never been interested in other men's definitions of success. He'd built his empire by focusing on results rather than methods, and the results spoke for themselves. Troy Kellerman was destroyed. The women he'd victimized were healing. Lily was home and compliant. The broader business community had learned what happened to people who crossed David Brennan. It was, David reflected, one of his finest construction projects. And like all his best work, it was built to last. Chapter 9. Foundation for the Future. 2 years later, David stood in the same spot where this story had begun, overlooking a construction site, though this one was different. The luxury hotel was complete and thriving, but this new project was more personal. It was a women's crisis center, funded by an anonymous donation but built with David's personal supervision. The irony wasn't lost on him. A building designed to help women escape destructive relationships, constructed by a man who'd rebuilt his own marriage on a foundation of controlled surrender. But David had never been troubled by ironies. He dealt in realities, and the reality was that this building would help people, regardless of his motivations for building it. The dedication ceremony is next month, Amy Chin informed him as she reviewed the final inspection reports. She'd become one of David's most trusted allies in the business community, her position at Pinnacle giving her access to information networks that proved invaluable for his various projects. "Any word from our friend in Phoenix?" David asked casually. Amy's expression darkened. "He tried to apply for a position with a Seattle marketing firm last week. They called Pinnacle for a reference. And I made sure they understood his employment history thoroughly." David nodded approvingly. Troy's exile was permanent, enforced not by legal restraints, but by a network of professional relationships that ensured his reputation preceded him wherever he went. It was a more elegant form of justice than physical punishment, and far more lasting. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Lily appeared at the construction site, something she rarely did unless specifically invited. She was carrying a manila envelope, her expression carefully neutral. "We need to talk," she said quietly. David dismissed his foreman with a gesture and followed Lily to his on-site trailer. She placed the envelope on his desk with trembling hands. "Divorce papers?" David asked, his voice betraying no emotion. "No," Lily replied. "Medical reports." David opened the envelope, scanning the documents. His expression remained unchanged, but something shifted behind his eyes. "How long have you known?" he asked. 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure before telling you." The reports confirmed what Lily had suspected. She was pregnant. After 12 years of marriage and months of carefully monitored reconciliation, they were going to have a child. David set the papers aside and studied his wife's face. "What do you want to do?" "I want to keep it," Lily said quickly. "I know our situation is complicated, but this could be a chance for us to really start over." David was quiet for a long moment, weighing implications and calculating outcomes. A child would change everything. The dynamics of their relationship, the structure of their rebuilt marriage, the very foundation upon which his revenge had been constructed. "This child will be raised with complete honesty," he said finally. "No lies, no deception, no hidden agendas. They'll know exactly who their parents are and what we've been through." Lily nodded, tears starting in her eyes. "I understand. And you'll sign a new post-nuptial agreement. One that ensures our child's security regardless of what happens between us." "Of course." David stood and walked to the trailer's window, looking out at the crisis center taking shape under Seattle's gray sky. He was thinking about foundations again, not just the concrete and steel that supported buildings, but the deeper structures that supported lives. His phone buzzed with a text message. Rico, Phoenix update. Kellerman arrested for check fraud. Looking at 18 months minimum. David deleted the message without responding. Troy Kellerman's spiral continued its predictable trajectory, but David found he no longer derived satisfaction from monitoring his enemy's destruction. The victory was complete, the justice served. Now it was time to focus on construction rather than demolition. We'll need to remodel the house, David said, turning back to Lily. A proper nursery, safety modifications, the whole project. We'll do whatever you think is best, Lily replied. David studied her face, seeing not the passionate woman he'd married or the deceitful stranger she'd become, but something new, a co-contractor in a long-term building project. Their marriage would never be what it had been before Troy Kellerman entered their lives, but it could become something different, something built on mutual understanding rather than romantic illusion. The child will know about Troy, David said suddenly. When they're old enough to understand, they'll know the whole story. What you did, what I did, how we handled it. They'll learn that actions have consequences, and that some damage can be repaired if people are willing to do the work. Lily nodded again, understanding that this was David's version of forgiveness, not absolution, but inclusion in a shared future. Over the following months, David threw himself into the renovations with the same intensity he'd once devoted to revenge. The nursery was a masterpiece of safety and comfort, with custom woodwork that rivaled anything in his commercial projects. He installed security systems that could monitor a child's breathing, temperature controls that would maintain perfect environmental conditions, and communication devices that would ensure no cry went unheard. When their daughter was born, they named her Emma, after David's grandmother. She entered a world that had been prepared for her with mathematical precision. Every contingency had been considered, every risk minimized, every need anticipated. But perhaps most importantly, she entered a world where the truth was valued above comfort, where loyalty was earned through consistency rather than demanded through control, and where the strongest foundations were built not on love alone, but on mutual respect and shared understanding of what could be lost when trust was broken. David held his daughter for the first time in the same hospital where he'd been treated years earlier after a construction accident. His hands, scarred from decades of building, cradled her with infinite gentleness. She would grow up knowing that her father was a man who finished what he started, who honored his commitments, and who never forgot those who betrayed him. But she would also know that he was capable of building beautiful things from the rubble of destruction, including, perhaps most importantly, a family that could survive the worst storms and emerge stronger than before. As Seattle's skyline glittered beyond the hospital window, David Brennan held his future in his arms and began planning the most important construction project of his life, raising a daughter who would never doubt her worth, never accept betrayal as inevitable, and never forget that the strongest foundations are built to last forever. The architect of justice had become an architect of hope, and his greatest work was just beginning. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.